We continue our coverage on the passing of Prince Buthelezi. The Deputy National Assembly Speaker, Lechesa Tsenoli, joins us now just for reflections on his life. Mr. Tsenoli, good evening to you. Thanks for your time. So, the longest serving member of parliament in this country, literally there from inception of this parliament, at least the democratic parliament in 1994, to where we find ourselves today. What did that mean to have him as part of those in the chambers?
Kathy, it's sad that we've had to lose one of our oldest members. He was an outlier just in terms of age, and I dare say in terms of his level of maturity. So it's very sad, and thus we join the President in conveying our condolences to the family. The presiding officers associate themselves with the feelings of sadness at his loss. He represented an important part of our history. I knew him for particularly more than these 30 years we were in Parliament together. Because in the 80s, I was in the leadership of the UDF during very difficult circumstances. And things happened there that I guess will be subject of a discussion in the next period of time. But the moment requires that we feel the loss of the family, because we ourselves, we've been losing members, but he is the oldest and the most mature of them all who we now lose now as the National Assembly. We think it diminishes us. He was one of the most passionate debaters. He also had extreme discipline. His speeches were all written and organized ahead of their presentation in the House by himself. And as presiding officers, we would each get a copy of his speech. That level of discipline was a very exemplary one. We felt he was one of those of the old school, so to speak, who insisted on preparing in advance and writing it out systematically and then presenting it in Parliament and sharing it. So he understood the need to communicate his perspectives and his views, which he often expressed with strong feelings. He was also useful to us as presiding officers because he often stepped in to help maintain calm when things went really out of hand in the House. And he was often right in the middle of it. So it was always a difficult moment for him to have to do that in the first place, helping the attempts of the presiding officers to keep the House in decorum and conducting its affairs in a disciplined manner. We've lost a good leader in that space and in that environment. I guess, Kathy, we should also acknowledge that the period of the past, in KZN especially and in Gauteng, the story is yet to be fully told. We must seek the truth in the facts that are presented. There are very strong feelings each way of the political divide, and people have been hurt. Some would suggest that they haven't recovered from the fatalities that were committed in the past. And so those conditions meant that he is, as a leader of the party, one of those who received blame for those. But I think we shouldn't be going there, because I think it is important, as he himself used to say, that where things happened and may have happened in the way they did, he wishes to apologize. We must appreciate those words. It's important that as leaders, especially of that level, to do that properly at the right time, all the time. But the difficulties of the past will be subject of debate amongst us for a long time to come. That period is yet to be written about fully, and some of the stories be told to the extent to which we can as part of presenting that period with all its facts. Some of them will not be so nice.
Mr. Tsenoli, as you speak on this issue, we had Reverend Zondi on just in the last hour, and he, of course, echoed statements that had been made by Prince Buthelezi that there's a lot that was happening in the country at the time that people were not privy to, and a suggestion that, some of the actions he was not taking them independently, but that there was instruction or influence from the ANC that led to things being the way they were. As a member of the UDF at the time, I mean, is that an accurate reflection of what happened? Is it ahistorical?
That's an interesting story, because I think the meeting in 1979 of Prince Buthelezi and President Oliver Tambo of the African National Congress, the results thereof and subsequent developments have been a matter of debate. And I think this is one of the areas in which I think things are going to have to be stated forthrightly, because now at least we are open, or we should be. Transparency must reign so that we clarify what happened in those discussions and then subsequently the decision to go otherwise. I know from personal experience of stories that people told us that some of them joined the IFP because it was a cultural organization. They felt that it represented something about which they felt strongly about. But unfortunately, it then turned to become a full political party. And so those who persisted in that path became victims of violence, because some people, we are told, were not liking the very idea that others would stick to that cultural story that was linked to being part of the ANC and so on. So Reverend Zondi is correct in pointing us in that direction to have a full discussion and debate, and those who were close to our leadership at the time will be able to communicate fully.
Of course, this is something that matters, Mr. Tsenoli, because if we look at the latter part of his life, Prince Buthelezi really wanted, some say, to sanitize history or history's account of this. He wanted his own voice represented, as he often said. He wanted the lies debunked, lies driven mostly by the ANC debunked. How did this play out in the National Assembly and in Parliament? Because one does see this very deep division between the ANC and the IFP, and yet at the same time, we cannot look at the figure of Prince Buthelezi without acknowledging the fact that he started off as an ANC Youth League member, at the time of his youth, gone at Fort Hare University, to the extent that when Fort Hare was marking one of its significant birthdays, he was the one that was called upon to deliver the Matthews Lecture.
Yes. No, Cassie, the truth about his origins, political origins, and then there were differences that were expressed about what he did, what he said at different stages, depending on where people were at that time. But in Parliament, I think what we can say is that President Nelson Mandela saw it fit to appoint him as one of the ministers. And that was a very serious gesture to the IFP as a political party for its leader to be appointed that way, to suggest, as Madiba did then, not only did he appoint him, he also subsequently appointed Musibudi Mangena, for example, from Azapo. And subsequently also other leaders of the IFP received leadership positions amongst the presiding officers of Parliament, so that they constituted part of that. It was a political gesture by the leadership and the ANC to cooperative relationships that were required to rebuild our country on a different platform. The contestations about what happened are really matters that I'm suggesting will have to come out in a more considered manner. Unfortunately, we will be speaking without him being able to respond for himself, given the current circumstances. So that's the one issue that I think there were differences about what happened in the past, because people did things in his name. And so he contests that he was himself behind those. There are small confrontations that we became part of ourselves personally with the bishop, about 4 bishops in KZN, attempting to mediate the differences between us and them. And in his presence, there's an expression, in other words, the way he got angry at certain times, it was extremely difficult to talk to him when he had reached that stage in his perception of what was happening. And so we became victims of his verbal attacks in the media during that period. But that was the nature of the confrontations at that time. And I think this is why I'm suggesting that the moment requires of us not to go into sufficient details. You know, the family is mourning at the moment. We must be sensitive to that reality. And so it is better that we reserve that for later consideration. But there were a definite, and I'm suggesting that this is how we start to play. Ideologically, there were differences, for example, and he expressed his views on those matters very directly in Parliament during many different debates. You couldn't hesitate to understand where to understood on any matter, especially from an ideological point of view. And so the differences that were expressed about his positions would have been done during those debates as well. There couldn't have been any misunderstanding of the relationships.
Mr. Tsenoli, this country has evolved quite significantly since 1994. How would you say that his evolution could be tracked, particularly in Parliament, alongside those changes? And one really also has to look back to the tumultuous time that this country went through during the presidency, at least towards the end of the presidency of former President Jacob Zuma, and what happened in Parliament and the role that Prince Buthelezi played there.
Well, I guess the developments in the country are correct. We have gone through many different storms, and part of the role that he played significantly was because of the nature of the conflict and how it often was at the center of the work of Parliament. I said earlier that he behaved in a very exemplary manner. Although he may have differed at certain stages with what the ANC stood for example, but there was no question about his insistence that things be done in a disciplined manner, that there be decorum, that the Parliament and its stature and how it handles things must be seen to be doing its work properly. And his many proposals for what he thought must be done to change things. He, as I said earlier on, documented his perspectives very systematically all the time. We may not have always agreed with him politically, where we had to look at things from that point of view. But from a parliamentary perspective, I think his presence in the House was always useful. And he had a sense of humor to boot, and makes the House often quite burst apart with laughter when he was in his element. So we will miss that part of him. And in the negotiations, for example, that happened in the past, in the process that led to the Constitution and finalization, he was persuaded by circumstances, I guess, on the ground to finally come into the negotiations. If you remember, Casey, the ballot of '94, we often say that it was added to with a press stick with the name of the IFP, so that it's part of the entirety of the ballot. because his initial intention was not to participate. His initial intention was a reaction against what he saw as being a disappointment, because what he sought at that time was what's called international mediation, which the country, or rather the majority of political parties, did not agree with. So he felt offended by that, because there are certain demands that he thought that such an intervention internationally would have placed things most likely in his favor from where he was standing.
All right. Mr. Tsenoli, it sounds like you've certainly got a lot to say on the subject, and yeah, it will be keen to hear what more you'll be at least more comfortable to share in the coming days. The Deputy National Assembly Speaker, Lechesa Tsenoli.